So what I'm going to cover for my session just now is a brief overview of what new methodologies are available for us, particularly with regard to measuring diet. That's what I mostly focus on. But then thinking about how we might develop those tools to be useful in a food safety context. That was my brief. And then perhaps to broaden things out around the big data area, thinking about, well, okay, what big data have we got, could we get, and could that be useful? And I'm going to give you an example of how that is being used around food poisoning and tracking food poisoning incidents. Touching inevitably, and I think very importantly actually, on the ethics of all of this big data collection, and then thinking, how can we do better? How can we improve things as we go along? How can we learn from, as it were, our mistakes? Okay, so I like this slide, and really it goes without saying, and I know you're way ahead, but in the UK, you know, over 3/4 of adults now access the internet daily. Over 90% own or use a mobile phone, and the majority of those are smartphones. And I think the thing to sort of emphasize here, and this is why it's important, is that more time is now spent using media and communications like this than we do sleeping. So 8 hours, 41 minutes sleeping, 8 hours, 21 minutes type of thing per day. So we're actually spending more time on our phones, etc. So a web tool or an app that could be useful for self-monitoring diet could be a convenient way of tracking what the population is eating, and inevitably then a link to food safety issues. So new technologies to measure diet. I've given you an example of some different technology categories. There are obviously the use of the computer, and there are, I mean, nuances, if you like, but nevertheless, these are all slightly different with different challenges and technical sort of issues around them. So we've got web-based recalls or diaries, and indeed food frequency questionnaires as well on the web. ASA24, many of you, I'm sure, will be very familiar with that, and I'm sure Amy will be talking about that shortly. MyFood24, that's the tool that we've developed in my group. And then there are non-web-based ones, which actually have much less currency, if you like, but those are still available, and people are still talking about PDAs and this sort of thing with the mobile phones. There are self-monitoring apps, MyFitnessPal being obviously the most popular, but also other things coming off your smartphone, tweets, other social media type of thing, and you can also geolocate those, making it interesting, diet, where were you, etc. Camera methods, non-automated cameras, you know, you ask people to take a photo and then you send it back. Perhaps not, you know, that's a stepping stone, but maybe not useful for sort of fully fledged new technologies. More of the automated cameras as diet buttons, as SenseCam, DietCam, which you don't even have to think about. You just put it on, as this badge might be, and it just takes photos of what you're eating. And then there are other types of data which really come under the big data category, if you like, the consumer data, till receipt type of thing, barcodes, barcode scanning, and wearable sensors, things that you can have implanted in your tooth for chewing and swallowing, that kind of thing. So there's a range, but how much do we know about how valid these different approaches are? How cost-effective are they? And a recent review that we've done of potential new technologies for our National Diet and Nutrition Survey showed that there was very little evidence. People had said, oh, it's much cheaper, you know, very cost-effective. But actually, when you drill down to it, there was really next to no economic analysis had been undertaken. And those of you who've been involved with this will know just how expensive, well, time-consuming, therefore expensive, creating some of these new technologies and bringing them, you know, forwards for use, how expensive that is. So to say, you know, that these are cost-effective, these are cheaper, etc., may be true, but a lot of work in the build-up, so there's not much evidence on that. And what potential have they got, if any, for food safety aspects? And I'm going to touch on that shortly. So I'm sorry but anyway, this is an example of the tool that we've developed in Leeds. There are others, other brands are available. There's a group in Newcastle who've developed something called Intake24, which looks very nice. And Amy, I'm sure, is going to talk about ACER24. But these are online dietary self-monitoring tools, or at least potentially self-monitoring. And you can see our login screen, and if you want to try it out, you can go to it, and you can actually press this button, try a demo, and you can see what we've got there to offer. And then you just, hopefully intuitive, but there are things that we can improve, and of course that's all expensive, get it remodeled, redone, etc., etc. As part of our attempts to undertake validation of this tool, we've just finished collecting lots of data from 200 people in collaboration with Imperial College colleagues, and we've measured a range of recovery and other biomarkers, and we're going to compare that with the results of nutrient intakes from both our tool and a couple of other online tools as well. Feasibility, okay, we could all do this, easy peasy, but you don't have to get much older than me to find people who quite struggle. And, silver surfers are out there, but not everyone's a silver surfer. And so to ask, to send an older population an email saying, log on, click this, do that, struggle. Whereas we have done some work, nice work with adolescents, and this is work of one of my PhD students, Salwa, where, they find it's like falling off a log, no problem at all. So these are new technologies, they are moving into the population, and, before too long, it just will be second nature for everyone. It is possible for us with this tool, MyFood24, we've designed it so that although it's designed for self-completion by the participant in our research studies, it can be, the researcher can, as it were, take control and complete it on behalf of the participant themselves. So that does make it a bit easier for those maybe who are not so computer literate, but computer literacy is an issue with these sorts of tools. It won't be forever. Oh, sorry, let me just point out to you then what this slide is showing, where it's relative validity. So this was in 75 adolescents who completed our tool, MyFood24, and a multiple pass recall on 2 non-consecutive days. The good thing was we found strong agreement, although there was quite a range, as you can see from this Bland-Altman plot, but the mean difference was just 55 calories with a range there, but no, this is good and better than many other sort of comparisons of a similar nature. Self-monitoring apps, so although that system is set up for sort of use on the computer, it is web-enabled through the app, so you could look at it on your phone, but there are apps such as the My Meal Mate, which has been designed to be downloaded onto your phone, and then you don't need even to have access to the internet to use it for self-recording. Of course, when we designed this 5 years ago, this sort of black and white kind of look was the newest thing. Of course, now we've had to redesign it and reskin it, so that we're about to launch a new version, which looks a lot cleaner, a lot crisper, but, within a matter of months, new designs, new styles, new approaches come forward. So anyway, if you were interested in that, wait a couple of months. We'll have an improved startup screen, clearer layout. We would like to add barcode scanning and social media links. We've used this tool to support weight loss and has been shown in a randomized controlled trial to significantly improve weight loss in overweight and obese patients compared to other forms of self-monitoring. So that was what it was designed for. Could we use it, though, to track diet for a food safety perspective. And just to sort of tie up this a little bit in terms of reliability of diet from apps, how good are they? And this is some work that's been done by Juliana Chen from the University of Sydney in collaboration with us. And she reviewed the top apps for weight loss apps and self-monitoring apps from the Australian Google Store, etc., and used to collect a 3-day food diary compared to sort of a standard one. And you can see that although on average it was a reasonable sort of, sorry, this diamond, I don't know why that's there. I think, you know, when you reformat these slides, it all moves about. I think this diamond's supposed to be here. So it's just difference of 127 kilojoules. But actually, between the different apps, a big range, underestimation of over 2,000 kilojoules to over 3,000 overestimation. The MapMy apps were the best if you wanted to know where is MyFitnessPal. It's here, so that's not too bad, but you know, a big range. So is that good enough? You know, can we rely on that? Could you rely on that if you wanted to use one of these? Say this one here, Calorie Counter by Fat Secret, to help you lose weight. Might not be as helpful as you thought. Okay, so can we use these diet measures from apps and websites for food safety possibilities? And I just sort of in reviewing that, the authenticity and safety of food in the food supply relate really to knowing things about the food that we're consuming, including where it's coming from, the geographic origin, type of agricultural production, the species perhaps of the original animal, type of raw materials, processing and packaging, additives and contaminants, maybe the presence of allergens, and more people are interested in sustainability or the ecological footprint. And the ones that I've sort of ticked are those that I feel that we might be able to get a purchase on with some of these new technologies. How many of those characteristics can be measured or tracked then? And all of this, knowing about this, obviously important for a whole range of reasons, not least, I would suggest, around consumer sensitivity. And here's a list of product recalls over the last sort of few years, which really resulted due to perhaps contamination of certain products or certain brands, or you know, adulteration, or microbiological contamination, or maybe even allergies, you know, nuts in a chocolate produced not in a nut-free environment, that kind of thing. So it's important for us to be able to track these different food items, maybe specifically at the brand level, so that we can really try and unpick our food supply. And it was really interesting when I was looking at preparing this talk to find the Open FDA, which you probably all know about, and I hadn't until just recently. And part of that is this recall enterprise system, which has information about recall notices, product recalls, market withdrawals and safety alerts for things including foods. And it's I think it would be interesting, those of you who are into mining, you know, big data, here is a source of big data through the Open FDA. I don't think our Food Standards Agency is as yet as open as that. They're obviously, you know, all trying to be more and more open, making, you know, documents available. But when it comes to data, that might be a different thing. Okay, so food safety. So if we want to trace our food products through that food chain, it's dependent on the epidemiology, identifying the food or the component to be traced, the complexity of the supply chain. Traceability is not necessarily the same thing as diet intake, which is where I started. And to be most effective, I would suggest you want data in real time. You don't want something that's 2 years out of date, you know, N. Haynes with all due respect, fantastic survey, but does reflect data collected in the past, as does our own National Diet Nutrition Survey. So could new technologies provide answers to some of these issues? And I want to give you an example of a multinational loaf of bread. Here we are, it's a staple white loaf. So you think, well, there it is. How hard can it be to track that? But then you break it down into its ingredients, a whole range. It's not just, if you were to make that yourself, you might take some flour out of the cupboard, you might get some yeast, you might mix it all up with some, even then, making it yourself, you've got a few ingredients. The commercially produced one has got considerably more ingredients. And when you look at where those ingredients have come from, all over the world. So tracking and tracing all of those things, if there was a problem, for example, with the honey that went into it, where was the problem arising, which nation, what was the source of that, how did we get it, can we stop it? You probably all know this more than I do because I'm just normally looking at nutrients, but I'm having to think a bit about foods, food ingredients, traceability, etc., and clearly challenging. So could we track that loaf using new dietary assessment tools? Well, actually, no, we couldn't. Not at the moment. Maybe we can in the future. So I'm being a bit aspirational here. I'd hope that, as we think about these things and we apply these new technologies to our dietary assessment tools, maybe we can. So we need to think about, how we're going to use our new tools in this context for both participants and researchers. It's all very well saying, well, I can tell you how many calories were in it, but I can't tell you where that honey came from. If you need to know that for tracing products with contaminants in or something like, that becomes quite tricky. So for me, the research questions around using these new technologies for food safety are all about the food and nutrient databases and the portion size estimations. If we can get those right and set up appropriate sort of cohorts for tracking, monitoring, etc., we can then do this in real time. But until we've got those right, it's all about guessing worst case scenarios and that kind of thing. It's a very nice talk by Carolyn at the start, which covered all of that, using the best data available. But can we do better than that, is my question. So I'm coming back to the MyFood24, deliberately here now, and I've given you the web link if you want to try that demo, it's there. Because what we have tried to do with our new tool is take things a step forwards, so that instead of just including the UK generic food composition tables, which have, depending on which set you use, but sort of around 3,000 to 7,000 foods on those generic tables, we've tried to expand that to include brand level information so that we could begin to drill down at the brand level. So we have now got about 35,000 items on our database, and taking that international loaf of white bread, I just typed in white bread into our system and got the option for 255 items matching that search. So it begins to start saying to me, well, actually then, okay, if it was a particular brand that was contaminated with something, we could trace that, see who was using it, etc., if we were doing regular monitoring. There are systems in the UK, anyway, that I'm familiar with, Kantar, World Panel, and so on, where they have detailed records of purchases, but you can buy stuff and put it in your store cupboard and maybe never eat it. I mean, you don't come to my house because you will find some of those items. So this is more about what you've bought and what you've eaten. 5 minutes, gosh. Sorry, I've rambled on. Right, so we've got 225 branded items versus the 25 generic, which is what everyone else has got to work with up until now. And if you look at the nutrient intakes from the generic versus the branded, you can see that although on average they are rather similar, the range is much greater in the branded. And this information's from the back of pack declared nutrient labels. So, as I say, we've taken these branded items, we've taken the information on the back of the pack, and we've mapped it to our generic items on energy, fat, protein, and carbohydrates so that we could infill the missing nutrients. Brand label information varies, so depending, what's in the food might vary from what's on the label, but at least it has to be relatively close. And in the EU, there are tolerance levels recommended. There are some new EU legislation coming out this year, being enforced this year. So already we have information required by law on the food labels, and you can see all of that here. We also now have to have country of origin, allergen information. If foods have high levels of caffeine, that has to be declared, and so on. So tracing all these things a little easier. And the UK is the ready meal capital of Europe. So more people in the UK than anywhere else are eating ready meals with all this label information available. Could our generic food tables help? And that's what we've got up till now. Well, I'm suggesting probably not. And the reason is because the nutrient values, certainly in the UK that we have, are formed from composite samples, probably as a result of not wanting to demonize anybody, but they just buy their 6 sausage rolls, smush them all up, and then measure how much fat, how much energy, etc. What I'd like to know is what's in each of those sausage rolls. So we have a store called Greg's, what's their sausage roll look like compared to the one from Marks and Spencer's? How much trans fats between the two? At the moment, we can't do that, but hopefully, perhaps we could. I'll just pass on supply chain tracking, but it's possible to do that for animals, tracing other components. So this is now big data. You see, it sounds like I'm only halfway through, but actually I am a bit further than that. Thank you very much. I have come a long way. I'm feeling a bit jet lagged. Okay, so big data is the other option for us for tracking diet. And just to, I don't want to read through this list, but here's some definitions, if you like, in terms of what it is: digitally generated, passively produced. So, when it comes to people filling in, you don't have to do it. It's all there, ready for you. But very large amounts of structured and unstructured data. So maybe what you've got on your till receipt could be the structured. Your Twitter account is unstructured. But we can tag you. We know where you are geographically and when you ate that burger, time-wise. Both public and private sectors, we've heard this morning in the open data session about the difficulties of actually doing stuff with this big data analytics, managing, harmonizing, bringing it all together. These are some of the challenges. And when it comes to thinking about health outcomes or tracking for food safety, we need to have data linkage in there as well. So here's my example around food safety and big data: food poisoning. The National Health Service advice is, if you've got a tummy bug, stay at home and recover, making it difficult to monitor the actual number of food poisoning outbreaks in a year. So social media might be a novel way to monitor the outbreaks. And people have been studying language used in tweets. So rather unsavory, I suppose, this, but anyway, collecting tweets related to foodborne illness, such as vomiting, stomachache, rather than more sort of technical scientific terms, food poisoning, salmonella, etc. So trying to create something that might indicate whether people have actually got food poisoning and they're tweeting about it. So this is one paper, Saladek, work underdone in New York City, and they identified 25,000 restaurants which were geocoded, where were they, and collected 2.8 million tweets in that area between December 2012 to April 2013. So actually, not very long, 4 months. 2.8 million tweets. They used Amazon Mechanical Turk. Sounds like a poor person really there, doesn't it, who's working to label these tweets in a subsample, but it's, you actually do it by, they have a group of people sort of labeling by hand this subsample of tweets to say, yeah, we think these indicate food poisoning. And then that's used as a training data set for machine learning methods, because you clearly couldn't hand label 3 million tweets. So then that labels it, sort of learns how the person's labeled it, and then the computer does the rest. So they, using this approach, created a health score whether you visited the restaurant and became ill, and this was correlated highly with food inspection data, which showed that there were or were not foodborne illness outbreaks. And they've created this rather nattily titled system called Nemesis, which, but anyway, there's, it's very nice. And so here, your little red dots are people who've been tweeting that might really indicate there's a problem here. So I might read them out just so there's only two. So delicious cooking smells coming from downstairs while I recover from food poisoning upstairs, #bad timing. And then there's another one here. All I ate for lunch was some noodles with butter, but suddenly my stomach is all crampy. Rude. So, you know, these are tweets that they've identified as potentially relating to food poisoning outbreaks. And you can see the number of tweets and, anyway, the sort of links between them. So there's a potential there, not been used fully yet. And I raise this because also my colleagues in Leeds are undertaking some similar work where they're collecting restaurant-specific user reviews from websites such as Just Eat and Hungry House, and they're aiming to see if people are suffering a foodborne illness after a visit, investigating spatial patterns of food poisoning in Leeds and comparing it against the Food Standards Agency data, because potentially there's underreporting of that. Social media, yes, useful, but maybe pros and cons there, and ethics of big data, which I think a couple of people have already touched on, you know, and it's really important. Are we identifying risk, or are we demonizing people's food products with real commercial sensitivities there? Do people know what they're agreeing to? When we developed our smartphone app, when we finished our study, we took the back end off to collect the data. And then we realized everyone else had left their back end databases on, were just collecting data without asking permission from anyone at all. So I thought, oh, bother, that was a bit silly. We were too ethical, were we? I don't know. But there's issues about, you know, do people know what they're doing, what you're doing with that? Are the results valid? Who owns the data? And what are the consequences? What if you make a mistake in your analysis? Could be commercially really sensitive. How can we take this forward? This is my last slide, you'll be glad to hear. So we are developing a sort of partnership, and I hope perhaps some of you have contributed to the Delphi consultation about guidelines already. We're developing a website called NutriTools, where we hope to have validated dietary assessment tools on there so that you can actually use them. There are helpful websites that point you in the right direction, but here this is about making the tools available. And here's my vision for the future. I'd like to have all this big data all gathered together, lots of more information on what we're eating, so that we can really reliably characterize the food and nutrient intake in population studies. Thank you very much. Sorry.